well, yes, please. And he said, fine, no problem. I won't spend too long on it because I've got other things that I want to tell you about journalism in the 1960s. But to cut a long story short, I interviewed the Beatles in their dressing room. I saw Paul McCartney in a state of almost complete undress because they had, the dressing room was quite small and they had a very small curtained off alcove, probably like this one here, and it had a chintz curtain, and behind that was a wash basin. And when I went into the room, George Hamilton, Ringo Starr and John Lennon were actually visible, but Paul McCartney wasn't. So I just got in and I just said, and the curtains opened and out came Paul McCartney wearing a hand towel, nothing else. And he went, oh, I'm so sorry, because he didn't realise that I'd entered the room. He said, I'm sorry, love, but my cats were killing me. And of course they were wearing these suits, silk, they were sort of a silk wool blend. And he perspired so much because this was between shows. They did 2 shows a night for 5 nights. And this was after the first show that I was interviewing them. And he perspired so much, I think his trousers had shrunk. So it was very, very uncomfortable. But there we are. I got that interview with the Beatles, and that was a great advantage to me in subsequent years. And I finished my apprenticeship with the Weekly News, and I decided that I would like to go and work in London. I had grandiose ideas that I was going to work on the national paper. I was going to be a foreign correspondent. I spoke some French, courtesy of my father. Oh, I'll be a foreign correspondent, no problem. Anyway, I started applying for jobs, and I got absolutely nowhere. So I thought, well, I've got to think out of the box here. I still wanted to get down to London and get into the centre of things, because don't forget, the swinging 60s, I was going to miss that, you know, London was a bit of a backwater. So I looked at other jobs, and I saw one advertised with the United Artists Film Company for a press officer, media officer, not media because it wasn't media, it was just a press officer's job. And the other one was with a public relations agency for someone to be an public relations account executive agency. And I applied for both, and they offered me interviews, and I asked for time off from the Weekly News, and the only day I could have off was Thursday, because that was publication day. So it was the quietest day. So I managed to arrange for both interviews in London on the same Thursday, and off I went down to London for the interviews on the train. And the first interview was with a public relations agency in the West End of London in Hanover Square with a guy called Bob Pollock, who, I don't want to be too insensitive or rude, but I would have changed the P for a B. But anyway, after I knew him better. But anyway, I had the interview with him in a coffee bar. Very, very trendy, you know, he was a very trendy guy. Had the interview with him in a coffee bar, and he straight away offered me the job and said, when can you start? Which, if I hadn't been quite as young and naive, I might have thought, well, this is a bit strange. Why are you doing that? But anyway, I said, oh, thank you very much. But yes, I said, thank you very much. I will accept your offer, because I didn't think for a minute that I would get the job with the United Artists Film Company. But I phoned my father and he said, yes, but you must go for the interview because you said that you will go for the interview. And blah, blah. So I turned up at United Artists in Wardour Street in Soho. And I walked in to the reception, and the receptionist said to me, oh, yes, Mr. Bernstein will be interviewing you. You can go up in the lift. He's on the top floor, and he's waiting for you. So I get into the lift, and I go up to the top floor of United Artists Film Company's offices, and the lift opens into this palatial office with thick shag carpet and a huge mahogany desk. Behind it is sitting this little gentleman with a slightly bald head. And he got up and he came out and said, oh, Judith, lovely to meet you. Shook my hand. Would you like to sit down? have a cup of coffee. I'll get my secretary to bring us some coffee. Ooh, very nice. So, and then we have the interview, and it's all very informal and friendly. And at the end of it, he said, well, thank you very much for coming. I appreciate you making the journey from North Wales, etc., etc. And off I went. Well, that was it as far as I was concerned. He told me that I would be helping to handle publicity on the James Bond films. They were doing the James Bond films at the time. You know, I mean, they weren't going to give that job to a little girl from North Wales who'd worked on a weekly newspaper. So I came back on the train, and the next morning, the post came, and as it did in those days, you know, you got letters the next day. Can you remember that? Yes, exactly, Jeff, exactly. And anyway, the post came, and my father picked it up off the mat, and he said, oh, there's a letter here from you, from United Artists, because it had it embossed on the front. So I said, oh yes, just tell me, you know. Anyway, I opened it. Dear Judith, I'm very pleased to offer you.
Wow.
Wow, Jeff. We're back to not what you know, it's who you know. But anyway, I said to my father, you know, what do I do? And he said, well, you've accepted the other job. You can't take this one because you've given your word. I mean, this is in the days when people gave their words and shook hands on things, and that was how you did business. So, but then anyway, I discovered afterwards that Uncle Herzl had been at work again, because Uncle Herzl was friendly with the Bernstein family, and the Bernstein family owned Granada Television and the United Artists, the UK arm of United Artists. So Charles Bernstein had actually welcomed me as his friend of a friend, if you like, because it was most unusual that the chief executive of a major film company would interview a little girl for So I didn't get the job. So I got the job with the public relations company, and I started, I actually started on the day of Winston Churchill's funeral. Well, I arrived in London on the day of Winston Churchill's funeral, which was a sort of tactical error actually, because of the street, obviously you couldn't move. But that explains when it was. Mr. Pollock had this office in Hanover Square. He was not an easy character, and it turned out that the only employees were him and me, and secretary and receptionist Anne, who was absolutely lovely. And he assigned me 6 clients. One of them was I call him the mad French hairdresser, Georges Aston. He owned a company called Carito, a very famous French beauty firm actually. And he was opening a salon in Bond Street right next to Vidal Sassoon. So he gave me that job. And I also had her Turn Shirts, which was the female branch of Turn Shirts, a fashion designer called Jean Muir, who actually was pretty iconic in the day, and lots of her work is now in the Victoria and Albert Museum. But anyway, Golden Wonder Crisps I had as well. I had these 6 clients. The Golden Wonder Crisps were their head offices were in Corby. I'd have to go down the train, and then I'd perhaps have to go to Tottenham to Turn Shirts factory in Tottenham to do a photo shoot. I was involved in organising a big fashion show for Jean Muir. It was a major event held at the Berkeley Hotel. As I progressed in the work, Mr. Pollock piled more on me. I did enjoy it, but my health suffered quite badly. And one day I went into the office, and Anne, the receptionist secretary, was off poorly. Mr. Pollock had gone to see a client in another part of the country, and I was the only person in the office, and I felt really, really ill. I thought I had a chest infection, and I felt really poorly. I tried to call the GP surgery on my way into work, but there was a queue out of the door, at the GP, so I just carried on to work, so I knew I had to open up the office, but I felt so ill, and I phoned my father, and my father said, it sounds as though you've got more than just a chest infection. I'd had pneumonia as a child, and I had had problems in the past with my respiratory tract. So he said, the son of a friend of his was working as a registrar at a Whittington hospital. He said, our phone, this is my dad, you say, our phone, anyway, he phoned me back and he said, yes, Paris, Edwards, this doctor's name was, he said, Paris has said, he can see you, if you get a taxi, get in a taxi and go straight there. So I tried contacting Mr. Pollock, but of course no mobile phones in those days. Yeah. I left a message at the place that he was going to be at, saying, I'm very, very sorry, I'm not well, I've got to go to hospital. So I got a taxi and went to Paris. Don't know whether I can say this really. I did know him actually, his father had a pharmacy in Panama, so I did know him. Anyway, he was waiting for me in his white coat when I got there. And he was examining me and he said straight away, we've got to admit you've got pneumonia. It was pretty obvious. You've got to be admitted. So I was admitted to the Whittington Hospital, and the only bed that they had available was in the ward on the top floor, which was for young ladies who had mental health problems. Some of them were suicidal, one of them tried to jump out of the window. So it was pretty dire actually, but at least I had a bed in the hospital. And I was there, I think about 10 days altogether. I was really quite poorly. And at the end, after 7 days, well, I was still feeling pretty rotten. And the secretary stroke receptionist arrived at the hospital, carrying a cardboard box with everything from my desk in it. And she said, Mr. Pollock says you needn't bother coming back because you left the office unattended. And she brought a letter from him. But that's what she said. I'm just repeating his words because we were quite friendly. She came in to stay with me here and I did know, and she was very upset. She was crying. But she said, here you are, and that was it, summarily dismissed because I was ill. You know, I don't think he would be able to do that now, would he? So that was a bit of a blow, but I was really poorly, and I went to convalesce with a friend of mine who lived in Hampshire, whose mum very kindly offered me time to go to their place in the countryside down there for a couple of weeks before I was well enough to travel back to North Wales. But I came back to North Wales, and I'd only been back a couple of days, and the phone rang, and it was Idwal Owen, who was the editor of the North Wales Weekly News, and he said, I believe you're back. I said, yes. He said, well, would you like a job back? Because he said, I thought you might be back. And he said, I haven't found anyone to replace you. So if you'd like a job back, it's still here for you, which was absolutely lovely. It was very reassuring to know that I'd got a job, obviously, to come back to. And so I resumed working for the North Wales Weekly News, and I just sort of slotted back into it very, very well. I felt very, very much. A few things had changed in a way that things had moved on a little bit because there was one other woman on the editorial team by then. To cut a long story short, I was covering all sorts of jobs, and then I got married, and very shortly afterwards I was expecting a baby. Afterwards, you know, it was all very respectable, you know. I tell you a story about the honeymoon that No, that's better.
That's another gallery.
Well, it was the night the clocks changed,
Oh, right.
and we didn't know. We went down for breakfast the next day, and everyone in the dining room was empty, and the staff were all looking at us as if to say, "Ooh." And it was just the fact that we didn't know the clocks had changed. Another story. I'm not going to ramble on very long, but anyway, so I was pregnant, and I carried on working. I was perfectly happy doing the job. I was very fortunate. I didn't have morning sickness or anything like that. I felt quite well through my pregnancy. But it was very, very useful because I could rest my notepad on it. So I would go out to jobs, and instinctively I would do this, you see. And that worked very well until I went to an evening event, and the owner of the newspaper, Mr. Jones, was at this evening event. And I think I was probably about 7.5, 8 months pregnant then, because I'd intended working all the way through. And I went into work, and the editor asked me to go up to his office. I went up to his, and he said to me, he said, Judith, he said, Mr. Jones was at the function that you were at last night. I said, oh yes, it was very nice. I spoke to him. And he said, yes, he said, he doesn't feel that you're now presenting the right image. You were resting. And he said, it's so prominent now, he doesn't feel it fits the image that you know. And he's also worried, of course, that you're getting a bit tired now and you won't be able to do the job properly and so forth. So I'm sorry that, you know, we've got to lay you off, but you have to leave, basically. It wasn't the sack, it was just, you're going because, you know, you're pregnant and we don't want a pregnant woman on the staff. And of course, there was no maternity leave then, absolutely no. So overnight, I lost my salary and we had a mortgage. So we were dependent then on one wage. And, you know, I just imagine if that happened today, the shock and horror and the controversy that it would cause. So I had one boss get rid of me because I had double pneumonia and was at death's door. I had another boss get rid of me because I was pregnant. And actually I wasn't as big with my son as I was with my daughter. It was like a beached whale with her. At least it was a fairly neat thumb. But anyway, so I was thrown back onto my own resources then. It was important that I did earn some money, so I decided to freelance. And this is where the experience that I'd had in London came in useful, because although I hadn't been able to get a job on a national paper as a news reporter, through my work in public relations, I had dealt with a lot of magazines and colour supplements, because my clients were in the sort of industries, not Golden Wonder Crisps, no, but the George Oster, the mad hairdresser, and Jean Muir in particular, the fashion designer, who was very, very lots of the glossy with photo shoots, articles about them, that sort of thing. I liaised with quite a lot of Vogue House was directly opposite our office, and I used to be in and out of Vogue quite a lot, doing things. We used to supply clothes for photo shoots, and I used to have to go in and make sure that the clothes were being properly looked after and handled. And we also used the facilities at Vogue House to do our own photo shoots, to produce publicity material for our fashion clients and so forth. I worked with David Bailey and a few of the leading photographers of the day. They were good contacts as well. There was a guy called Paul Vicenzi, who was an excellent photographer, and his wife Penny Vicenzi became the leading author. I don't know whether any of you, she writes Chicklit, or she wrote Chicklit. She's not long passed away actually. But so I made these contacts, And so when I decided to freelance, I was a member of the National Union of Journalists, and they produced a freelance directory. So I got my name in the freelance directory. And I also was able to get in touch with the editors that I knew, and commissioning editors on these national newspapers and magazines. So I started off on my free variety of work, because most of the work that I did was interviewing people. One of the first I did for the Sunday Express colour supplement was an interview with a chap called, he was always known as H.V. Kershaw, and he lived in Deganley, but he was one of the first writers on Coronation Street, and he commuted in from Deganley to Manchester, and he wrote hundreds of episodes of Coronation Street. So that was interviews because he was on my doorstep, and I knew of him through my aunt who at post office. See, contacts. But I had a big variety of jobs. I went down to Silverstone Race Circuit to interview for She magazine. I did quite a lot for She magazine. A lady called Davina Galici, who was one of the first, well, she was the first woman to race in Formula One. So I went down to the British Grand Prix to interview her. She had been an Olympic skier previous to becoming a Formula One driver. She was very, very interesting. I went out on a fisheries protection vessel for an article. I interviewed a woman wrestler. Lots and lots of very interesting things. I went to Catterick Camp and I drove a chieftain tank, doing the Margaret Thatcher thing, you know, standing up. Got photographs of that. So I found actually that as the 60s progressed, things got a lot easier for me career-wise in the opportunities that were open to me. The only job I did turn down was I got a telephone call one day from a Dutch gentleman. He was the features editor of a Dutch daily newspaper, and he phoned me and he said, Judith, he said, we would this was at the time when the civil war in Angola was at its height. We would like you to go to Angola for us to interview the leader of the UNITA rebels. So I said, oh, no. I had 2 children then. I said, no, I've got 2 little children. I can't go to Angola in the middle of a civil war. Oh, we'll make sure you've got good insurance. I think insurance is no good to my kids. If I've had a hand grenade blow me up, or you know. He said, oh no, you'll be taken care of, and we'll have armed guards for you while you're there. And I was thinking, so no, I did turn that job down, but at least it showed how things had progressed. Because, but then afterwards, I thought, hang on a minute, he's probably been through the freelance directory, and I'm P. Through the alphabet, and he'd got to P, and I reckon no one wanted this job in Angola. That was my thinking anyway. So I turned that down. So it was good, as I say, that eventually I was being offered jobs that I was being treated equally with a man, and on the local newspaper I was being treated equally. But really, honestly, through the 60s into the 70s, there were very few women on national newspapers, or even as reporters that had to be broken through. But because again, you know, I've interviewed people, children in very tragic circumstances, and lots of difficult things. But where again, I think as a woman, I perhaps was able to speak to them in a way that a man probably wouldn't have. I've sat and cried on a sofa with a man whose little boy had drowned. I've sat and hugged another lady whose son had died because he'd been sniffing an aerosol. You know, you do have to have a certain amount of resilience, but on the other hand, the gentle touch also of my life in the 60s. I could go on and on and on, because I usually do ramble. I don't like to ramble too much. If you've got any questions, we'll do some questions and a little bit more.
When you were freelancing,
Yeah.
were you commissioned or did you do the...
I was always commissioned.
You were always commissioned, yeah.
Because that way you knew you were going to get paid.
I wondered about that.
Because if you just do purely speculatively, then you know you're going to get rejection. You're not getting any money. So I was putting out ideas to commissioning editors. You know, I've got this idea of going to interview this person or whatever. And then after I'd been doing that for a few months, they were contacting me and commissioning me to do the jobs, to go out on the fisheries protection vessel. I have a woman to work on a fisheries protection vessel. So I interviewed her for She magazine. I did quite a lot for Country Living as well, which was great because places around here, there were so many things I did an article about a lady who was a farmer's wife here, but she did the most fantastic crochet, cobweb fine crochet work using llama. You know, all sorts of very varied jobs. And sometimes, and I had a column in a horse magazine, Your Horse Magazine, because I'm a horsey person, sorry. Your Horse Magazine. I had a weekly, fortnightly column in that because it came out fortnightly. So these were all regular. That was a regular job. And then, as I say, the commissioned work, you know, it was quite lucrative. Obviously, you know, it's undercover supplement. They pay very, very well. The only problem was that generally in the industry you had to wait 6 months to get paid, especially with magazines, the monthly magazines, because they work 6 months in advance. So they're doing Christmas in June. So their Christmas issue is being prepared in June. And consequently, there was always this delay. And I was always having to send up follow-up invoices and reminders to get the money. You know, it was very good when it came, but it wasn't regular. It came in dollops, which my accountant wasn't very keen on, really. And then I got a phone call one day. I tell you, I can ramble on this. I got a phone call one day from the then editor of North Wales Weekly News, who said to me, he said, "Would you consider coming back?" And I said yes, but only part-time, to allow me to carry on doing some freelance magazine work, which didn't clash with the news work. And also I wanted to fit it in around my children, because the freelance worked very well with my children, because I worked when they were at school. And then, you know, I was free to be. And he said, yes, fine. Terms and conditions, and he accepted them, which I suppose in a way is a compliment. But I carried on then working for them for another, 25 years, I suppose. I retired when I was 70.
Could I say something? First of all, can I book you, Judith, for my own obituary?
I don't know whether I'd be able to praise it down, Jeff. It would fill a book. Jeff has such a fantastic career.
More.
So,
anyway, more serious.
Yeah.
You very helpfully exposed the difficulties in the 60s and 70s with women in the workplace in the early phase of their reproductive life. But what's becoming a more concern now is the place of women in the workplace at the end of their reproductive life, dealing with the menopause and the period before the menopause and other gynecological problems in the meantime. And you obviously lived through that. Well, now that you've told us your age, I thought you were too young to have been through the menopause. Did you ever find
there was no recognition.
No.
You just carried on, basically. And I was lucky. I didn't get hot flushes. I would get quite bad tempered. I hadn't had his dinners were rotting. I was lucky in that I didn't have symptoms that affected work, really. But no, it wasn't discussed, it wasn't mentioned, it wasn't even thought about, just got on with it, didn't you? So, you know, that's the way it is. But I was very fortunate that my husband, as you know, I think died in an accident when I was 65. I had been on the verge of retiring, but I asked the editor if I could stay on because I wanted that structure to my life. I wanted to have a purpose to get up in the morning and go out and do something. And I loved my work, absolutely loved it. It was, every day was different.